set us up in regards to the article I would point everyone to that's going to go through the nuts and bolts and grind it down to the granular of exactly how you come to this formula. But basically, it's an evaluation of the talent, the roster on the talent for the 4 years that make up 98%, discarding generally fifth-year seniors because that class of players been taken out of being significant in the talent evaluation. But you're evaluating the 247 composite, putting a formula to it to rate the amount of talent. And then I find it interesting in reading the article just a few minutes ago that you're making an adjustment for lower level players that came into college football as lightly regarded players, but have shown to be capable players, impact players at this level. You gave the example of Tanner Morgan at Minnesota. Then you readjust and rate them accordingly.
Yeah, I wanted to come up with a metric a few years ago, particularly with more and more sports handicapping, and get ahead of these early markets for season win totals. And when we were kids and we used to do our previews and stuff for fun, you could just count returning starters and look WNL schedules and figure it out that way. But we're in an era now where so many guys go pro early. So many freshmen early enroll. You've got advanced strength and conditioning at the high school level now. You've got sub-packaging like you have in the NFL, where a guy like a Josh Uche might have been overall Michigan's best defensive player last year, but some games wasn't technically a starter. And so that in, and you need more than that. And so I think Bill Conley, used to be at SB Nation, now he's over at ESPN, has come up with a great metric looking at your returning production. So I use that as part of my preview and my win total predictions I put out every year. But while that tells me how good the talent you have coming back currently is, I needed to know how good the talent you have coming back could actually turn out to be, right? We had Georgia in a national championship game 2 years ago, a great game, and we had two freshman quarterbacks throwing darts at the end, Jake Fromm and Tua Tagovailoa. Most people didn't know who either one of those guys were. Unless you were a very knowledgeable college football season or college football fan before the season kicked off. So this is a sport where there's always the unknown variable. If I'd have told you last year at this time, Joe Burrow was going to have the single greatest statistical season of any quarterback in college football history, you had to be drug tested faster than you can say Ari Wasserman. All right. But it happened. Okay. So with those kinds of variables, who are the guys waiting in the wings? So when you lose a J.K. Dobbins, how good's a Master Teague or a Trey Sermon, right? When you lose a Shea Patterson, how good's a Dylan McCaffrey, Joe Milton, et cetera. And so to come up with that, I looked at the 24/7 composite recruiting rankings, which looks at all the major services. And I gave you points based off of what your ranking was coming out of school. 5 points for a five-star, 4 points for a 4-star, et cetera. And then what I did is I had to account for what we call developmental programs, like a Wisconsin and Iowa. These programs are always going to play way over Michigan State and D'Antonio's heyday, way over their recruiting rankings. So how do I account for that? Well, now after I do all of that, I then go through your roster, and if I look at guys who have played clearly above their recruiting ranking, and so a guy like a TJ Hawkinson who came to Iowa as a 3-star and then wins the Mackey Award, if he had come back for his senior year, I'd have rated him a 5-star player. All right, so I move you up based on how you've actually performed to account for player development and maturity over the course of their careers. And then I incorporate the latest news out of the transfer portal, who's left, who's coming in, but eligible right away, et cetera. I do account for fifth-year seniors, but only if they factor prevalently on the depth chart. And you're right, there's very few schools. Pittsburgh redshirts a lot of guys, Stanford does, Northwestern does, but there's not a lot of teams that utilize fifth-year seniors like when we were kids. So for most schools, if you just list one, I don't count him. It's got to be prominent on your depth chart. Otherwise, I don't consider him. And then I just do the math. And this is it's not a pure power rating. It's a factor to come up with one. It's not a ranking, meaning we don't factor in your coaching or your schedule. I am just at this early stage of the offseason now. I'm just trying to find out what the data shows is your ceiling from a personnel standpoint. How good are the guys we don't know about when you've got to replace, like in Ohio State has only 3 starters back on offense or something. So how good are the guys waiting in the wings? And that's what this is devised to try to answer that question as best as I can.
Yeah, it's a smart approach when you consider that there are 4 and 5 stars that are recruited and they show us nothing, especially at elite programs, their first couple of years. And then when the opportunity or their development reaches a certain place, which you wouldn't think that they would need the development, but some of them do, or the opportunity presents itself, they show out that junior season. And also the adjustment made for guys that were not regarded coming into college football, but then prove themselves to be capable players.
I mean, you look at arguably the two greatest Ohio State teams of the last 60 years, 1968, 2014. Both of those teams dominated by sophomores. Okay, unless you were a hardcore Ohio State fan, you didn't know what a Taylor Decker was. Yet you didn't know what that was. You didn't know what a Rex Kern was. Most Ohio State fans didn't know what a Rex Kern was in 1968. So how do you account for that? And that's what I'm trying to quantify is that.
Got Steve Deace on the line from Michigan Podcast and also Bigger 10. Please join him on those platforms. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Please like, comment, share the videos on social media, and subscribe right here for discussion and debate on a daily basis. So you've got Georgia at number 1, and I think it's a substantial margin over Alabama. And the only reason I say that is because I wouldn't know otherwise what 356 means versus 337, except
that just means the total talent points of their roster. When you added it up, the total. Yeah.
So by reading the article, but also by getting an indication of the point total gaps between the other teams. And that one's pretty substantial because Ohio State only trails in the number 3 position, only trails Alabama by 7 points.
So what that tells you is when we actually start lining up starters and known quantities, you may think Alabama is a better team than Georgia on the field. But as you get into if we have to go into a couple of years ago, I think I told you this, when Michigan State brought back like the 20 starters from the team that went 10-3, you'll recall that I warned you that when I ran these numbers for that season, I think I warned you, this is not a team with a lot of depth. The starters are good, and we know all their names. But if they start getting into injuries, they're in a lot of trouble. Well, they had a lot of injuries that year, and they turned out to be in a lot of trouble. So Alabama, that doesn't necessarily mean you should rate Georgia ahead of Alabama when you do your preseason poll. But what it does mean, though, is if Alabama has a year where they lose some depth, like last year they lost Dylan Moses, Tua Tagovailoa, and they end up in a Citrus Bowl, right? What that tells you is that the frontline players between Georgia and Alabama are probably identically the same. But if they get into a war of attrition, Georgia's got more depth, more margin for error to reach its potential than Georgia. Doesn't mean that with Kirby Smart as head coach, as opposed to Nick Saban, that they will. It just means that they're playing with a fuller deck here, and that's the best point that Ari Mosterman made to me on the podcast, is that even if you don't buy into the overall talent gap, with the more depth Ohio State has, it's got higher margin for error. And I do agree with that part.
Okay, I don't have numbers to back this up, but I got to think that those injuries would have to be substantial between those two programs in particular, that even the second line of the depth chart for Alabama and Georgia are extremely similar. I got to think that
it would have to be, depending on, are they freshmen, red shirts, sophomores? And that's the other thing is I don't release that publicly, because I use that to my advantage to play win totals. So I can tell you everything, okay? But I have this charted out by class. So if you asked me just, hey, dude, do me a solid here privately, I would answer that question for you. Right? Meaning that how much of that difference are guys who have not stepped on campus yet? You know what I'm trying to say? As opposed to
sure,
guys who have been 2 years into the program. I've got all that tabulated on spreadsheets on a year-by-year basis. So I could answer that. I just choose not to throw that out there in public.
So then the other portion of this that I see in the numbers, but I don't see it translating to the field necessarily, is I see a fairly evenly distributed point totals. Like I don't see like the top 3 and then this enormous gap, and then number 4 or number 10 and then there's an enormous gap. Like I'm not seeing tiers here. But
I disagree a little bit. I think the last 3 years in a row that I've done this is the 4th season I've done this. Every year, like my numbers, the first year I did this was 2017, and I had Georgia, the second most talented team. And so when I did my preseason college football preview, I put Georgia like as a top 10 team And a lot of people told me I was nuts. They ended up, that was Kirby Smart's second year. They had just only gone 8-5 the year before, and they went they were one play away from winning the national championship. So every year I've done this, Alabama, Georgia, and Ohio State have had the 3 most talented teams every year. It's just a matter of what their order is. And then what you tend to see is, and so every year so far, I've seen this now for 4 years. Georgia, Alabama, and Ohio State are the most talented teams. And then there's a group of teams from 4 to 10, or sometimes it's 4 to 10, 4 to 15, that are more talented than everybody else, but not demonstrably more talented than everybody else, right? And then after that, the difference between teams 15 and 35, teams 20 and 40 are just a few points, which means one key injury, and all of a sudden, really, Oklahoma State isn't any more talented than, say, Oregon State, frankly. All right. And I think that bears itself out in what we see during the college football season. The amount of teams that go 6-6 to 8-4, or 8-4 to 6-6, compared to the amount of teams that go 10-2 or better. I think that bears itself out when we actually start playing games.
And the reason I bring that up, that I don't see decided point differentials anywhere that would separate tiers, is that I see it play out, and I think it's been pretty obvious during the 6 years of this playoff that to make the college football playoff, especially out of those best teams in the Pac-12 and the Big 12 in particular, and what would be the ACC minus Clemson, for those teams to reach a college football playoff is obviously a tremendous accomplishment. But for those teams to win a national championship, for any of the teams that we've seen make it out of those leagues in the last 6 years, Oklahoma last year, Oklahoma a number of times, Washington in 2016, the difference between them making a playoff and actually winning those next 2 games against a very good team and then an elite team or 2 elite teams is like another complete season of having to go 12-0.
Yes. I think that bears it out in the depth numbers that you look at in my talent ratings. That's the quicker turnaround time, the elite talent. If you get a key injury in a game, how good your backup left guard, not good. And suddenly the middle of your line can't block, one guy that's an immense pass rusher for one of those elite teams. And it's like you can't run your basic offense. Yeah, I think that the air gets thinner up there. I agree with you on that.
So to run the recruiting rankings is one thing. That certainly is an exhaustive process for all these teams. Did you do all the Power 5? Did you include any Group of 5?
I do only the Power 5 in Notre Dame, just because I don't do this full time. But I do come across certain data with Group of 5 teams, obviously, when I'm looking at this. So, a couple of years ago, I had one of my best bet win totals was Toledo under the total. That ended up coming in. So, but I predominantly focus on the Power 5 in Notre Dame. And then I with the ACC because that's about half of their schedule every year.
Is that the quarterback position is obviously paramount. So is that weighted?
That will, in this metric, no. It will be weighted when I come out with my poll later this summer of how I think the season will end. All right. And so just so your audience knows, there's 2 things I will do before I start my preseason simulation, because my preseason is a projection of what I think the season will be. The first 2 things I'll do are these talent numbers, and then I will reconcile them with Bill Connolly's numbers. All right. I'm not going to rework returning production when somebody's already doing that and throwing it out there publicly. Why do I do that work all over again? Right? So I take Connolly's numbers and then put them together with mine. I take his numbers of how good teams currently are with my numbers of how good I think these teams could still be. And that's where I come up with a power rating. Right. And how I do my power ratings for my preview are how many games I think you can win within a 2-game range based on the personnel that you have against the traditional strength of your schedule. And then I give you a bonus 1 win. I move you up a bonus range if you return an effective, proven starting quarterback. I used to only do that if it was an upperclassman quarterback. But in the last couple of years, I've changed it because we've seen how many freshman quarterbacks take teams to the playoffs, right? It's happened several times. So now if you return an effective starting quarterback, then so for example, I would still on talent rate Ohio State a 10 to 12 win team. All right. But let's say I rated them a 9 to 11 win team. Well, with the return of Justin Fields, I'd move them up to 10 to 12 because I think it's at least a one game factor. And because again, what's the point of why you're doing your power ratings? If I'm doing my power ratings to determine a point spread, I'm doing a different math, right? I'm doing it to look at win totals. And so everything I do is determined by coming up with the best values and win totals. That's why I don't rate it like by a point system, but a win system. What I think your win total could actually be. And then what I'll do is I have a coaching metric where I look at your trajectory, your recent recruiting, how long your overall career, and I put all of that together. I'll release that here in a few weeks. And once I have the coaching rankings together with my personnel rankings, that's then when I will begin to go through your schedule, and I'll simulate it several times to project how I think the season will go.
So you used the example of a Tanner Morgan, lightly regarded coming into college football, turned in one of the most efficient seasons in the nation last year, a 10-to-1 TD to pick ratio. How far can you do that across a roster? Because we're talking about 75 teams. So if the left guard at Iowa was a 2-star recruit and he turns into an all Big Ten left guard, are you accounting for him as well? That's got to be exhaustive to go through all those players.
Yeah. So what I started doing this season, so I went, because the last few years, it took me a long time just to keep doing it, to start it from scratch in June or in May and June. So I got smart this year and I decided that I'm going to track all of the attrition this year. This is the first time I've kept a breakout by class of a spreadsheet, but in real time. So I took it from I took some advice from another Ohioan, Phil Steele. And the minute that this last season started, I started working on next season already. So when guys were entering the transfer portal in September and October, I was adding this to my 2020 spreadsheet right at that moment, so that I would not have to spend 2 weeks retconning all of this information like I had the last few years. So I kept track of this all season long. And then when this season ended and the NFL deadline to get into the draft ended, all I had to do was just delete the last column from last year and insert a new column with this coming recruiting class. And I had everything already up to date.
So like any good bettor, I'm sure that you're taking the numbers across the board and everybody's going to fall on one side of the win-loss versus what Vegas is telling them. But most or a great portion of those are going to be inconsequential in terms of the numbers difference.
Right, because they're not going to be much different from mine. Yes.
So then I'm looking at
I'm looking at if I have more than a half game, basically a minimum, a full game win total difference than Vegas. Those are the games that I'm looking for. Those are the teams.
So generally, and you've done this a number of years, generally out of 75 teams in the Power 5, do you have that level of confidence in making a wager on above or below the Vegas win total?
I think the last 2 years combined, I've put out 13 best bets. We went 9-4. So that gives you an idea. I mean, like one of the things I do every year is a podcast where before the win totals come out, I'll predict what they are and see how many I can get within a half a game. You'd be amazed at how many I can get within a half a game. It's a lot because I've run all these numbers and then I can kind of guess where the market is going to be. And I can guess that no matter how good Iowa is or isn't going to be, a team like that's going to be undervalued because it doesn't have high brand, right? Michigan and Texas, if they have a competent coach, is never going to have a win total lower than a 9. Just because, again, the power of those brands. Same with the Notre Dame, all right? So there's just certain things that are kind of baked into the cake that you know if you've been doing this for a while.
Steve Deace, Michigan Podcast, a Bigger 10. Join him on those two platforms. And there's also an outfit that you write for as well, Michigan. What is that?
Wolverine Digest is that? Yeah. That's with the Sports Illustrated network. Thank you. Wolverine Digest.
Steve, we appreciate you stopping by. It's always a fun and informative conversation. No question about that.
You bet, man. Take care. Go Blue.